All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, well, as it happens, this episode is on Christmas Day. It is December 25th, and if we're going to talk about faith and belief and the way that people find meaning in particular dates and times of the year on this Christmas Day, why not talk about astrology? That is a very hacky segue, I know, folks. But first off, Merry Christmas to everyone celebrating that day today. And let's talk about astrology. And we're going to talk a little bit about the political side of astrology, specifically a story that we've been wanting to get to for a long time, the Nancy and Ronald Reagan astrology scandal, the time in 1988, let's pin this, when stories began to break that the Reagans had a long relationship with astrology, that Nancy Reagan in particular would consult astrological charts and find meaning and comfort in particular times and dates, sometimes adjusting the president's schedule accordingly. Not to mention that she had a very pricey astrologist on retainer for a number of years. So look, we've been wanting to do this episode for a while, as I said, and as it happens, there is a new podcast out there that is all about astrology, and there is an episode devoted to the Reagans and their relationship with the practice. So I don't know if you want to call that a sign from the universe, a sign from the stars, a coincidence, whatever, who am I to say? But the point is, our special guest for this episode is Mangesh Hattikudur, who has done many brilliant things over the years, including founding Mental Floss, co-hosting the show Part-Time Genius, and now this new podcast all about astrology called Skyline Drive. Mangesh, welcome to the show. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I guess Merry Christmas. Total coincidence that it's coming out on that day.
Yeah.
Hey, as always, here, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello and Merry Christmas, Jody.
Hey there. I just want to say the three wise men, is it
yes!
wise men that followed the star to get to baby Jesus? This feels very on point to me.
Exactly. Thank you. And we should right off the bat say, in this specific episode of Skyline Drive about the Reagans, we should give a shout out to your showrunner, Mary, who had a huge part in this. You want to say anything about her work on this, and then we'll get into it?
Yeah, Mary is incredible. She is an insane researcher, and she read basically every book related to the Reagans. She was on the phone with the Reagan library. She found these Reagan oral histories, and so I feel at a loss without her here.
And a big part of this story is that it breaks in memoirs and books and then becomes scandals. So you have to go to the primary sources, as Mary did. But before we get into the specific scandals, I'm wondering if you can just lay out, because I think one of the things that your show does so well is, you explore how there's a real diversity within astrology, and it can mean a lot of different things to different people across cultures, across eras, across just kind of your personal relationship. So as best you can you kind of characterize what kind of astrology the Reagans seem to embrace?
Yeah, completely. So they mostly dabbled in Western astrology versus Vedic astrology, which is more sort of an Indian line in. But it's funny, I talked to an apprentice of a Vedic astrologer who said the Reagans came through there, and we couldn't get a second source to verify it, but it was the same astrologer for Tina Turner and a bunch of other like famous California folk, and so it sort of tracks. I mean, the thing for the Reagans is that they came up in California, and California and showbiz culture, which is such a superstitious culture, and so for them. And at the time, astrologers were kind of in the scene. And like, so this guy, Carol Reiter, used to throw the biggest New Year's party of the time and with fish for a Pisces party and a lion for a Leo party. And like, it was regularly written about in like the page 6 of the Times. And so like, you kind of wanted to be in that mix if you were a celebrity.
It's so interesting because I think Reagan in politics is pitched as the antithesis of the 1960s and the 1970s. But this particular kind of astrology and sort of a fascination with kind of the mystic becomes really central to kind of hippie culture in the West in the 1960s and 70s. So it's interesting to see the Reagans as part of that mix. They were as much a product of that culture as they were in some ways a response to it.
Yeah.
And they walk such an interesting line because I hadn't put this together. This was Mary telling me, but Nancy had met Ronald because she was on the blacklist at the time, you know, like the conservative blacklist, and her name accidentally showed up on it, and so she reached out to him as the president of the Screenwriters Guild to help, and so like they're on the very conservative side of the Hollywood sphere, but still very much in that Hollywood sphere.
So what is your understanding then? Well, I guess, you know, this breaks in a way as a Nancy Reagan scandal, but I think then very quickly there are questions about Ronald Reagan. So, you know, do you see this as a Nancy Reagan scandal, or do you see this as a both of Reagan scandal? And then we'll talk about how it kind of comes out.
Yeah, there's this amazing quote from Cary Grant where he says, you know, Nancy was so driven and I'm not saying it exactly right, but basically the essence is that Nancy was so driven for Ronald Reagan that if they'd been married earlier, he would have won some Academy Awards, and like that was she would basically do everything for him, and so his aides said like there would be no Governor Reagan, no President Reagan if it wasn't for her ambitions and her sort of corralling him. So you can't in some ways see them as separate units. I mean, I think that her sway over him was really, really important.
Okay, the scandal, such as it is. And I think you do a good point of pointing out in the episode that, you know, it had long been a scandal. I mean, I feel like every 4 or 5 years it sort of bubbles up as something that people notice. But, you know, I think the big time it breaks through is in 1988. A memoir gets written. There's a reference to this. And then the Reagans start to get peppered with a bunch of questions. Can you just sort of walk us through that moment? What comes out? What kind of questions are getting asked? And then also it's really fascinating to see how the Reagans, I think, try and largely flail in trying to answer the questions about their relationship with astrology.
Yeah, they really try to spin it, but the whole thing comes out because of this guy Don Regan, who was Reagan's chief of staff. And if you know the history of that period, Don Regan was the architect of trickle-down economics. He was had come out of like banking. He ends up being Reagan's chief of staff, and for a little bit between 85 and 87, he is really, initially, Nancy really likes his sort of authoritative style, but then very quickly they sort of butt heads. And she sees him as usurping her power. He gets blamed for the Iran-Contra fallout, and by 87 he's out. And so the next year, in 88, he puts out this book called For the Record. And in that book, it's kind of a tell-all of his period, but he references the fact that Nancy Reagan had a friend. He doesn't name the astrologer, but quote, a friend who had sort of a secret line into the White House and a dedicated line that she could talk to Nancy at any point. And Nancy would heavily adjust the calendars of Ronald Reagan's schedule. And so he was delivered this color-coded calendar where he could, you know, these days were off limits for dealing with big issues. These days when you could do a takeoff or a landing or like, you know, travel. And so it was very clearly dictated by the astrologer.
And Don Regan, just he hated Nancy Reagan. Like they had really fallen out by 1987. And he knows that this detail is going to be really damaging. I mean, as you were saying, she was a political partner with Ronald Reagan, but this is going to get her written off as this kind of flighty, mystical, believes in astronomers kind of puff figure in the White House, which is part of Reagan trying to assert his own prominence and dominance within the White House by sidelining her.
Yeah.
It's also hard, too, because astrology has been so stigmatized within American culture. You know, you're sort of trained to either see it as a scam or not as legitimate. And so the idea that someone could be investing in this in a way that might have political ramifications, I think would be troubling to a lot of people.
And that's the thing, right? I mean, there are two things there. One, as much as Nancy is a partner, we always blame first ladies, right? You know, and women are always like the fall person for these things. And I know, and so of course there's a Lady Macbeth element to it, and you know that's just a trope, unfortunately. But on the other hand, when you talk about Reagan, Warren Harding's wife was also heavily into astrology. Teddy Roosevelt used to keep his birth chart in his office so that he could keep a, quote, weather eye on the charts. I mean, Kennedy, Nixon, they all had astrologers in their ear at various points. And so, on one hand, it is so shocking to America. And on the other hand, it's also something that's been in the background quietly.
Before we go on, I just don't want to let it go past us that Ronald Reagan had a chief of staff called Donald Reagan.
Not great. Very confusing.
Yes. But let's, I guess maybe here we can sort of bring in the character of Joan Quigley, right? And so you want to tell us who she is and what the Reagan's relationship with her is?
Yeah, completely. So it gets revealed through Time magazine that Joan Quigley is the person on the other end of the line. And Joan Quigley is this sort of socialite in San Francisco who had actually met Reagan and Nancy Reagan a while back working on a campaign, but I guess had disappeared for the life for a bit. And then it gets revealed that after the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan in 1981, I think, Nancy hears from her friend Merv Griffin that there's a woman who could have prevented this. And she's like, oh, so someone could have stopped this? And it's like, yeah, Joan Quigley knew that on these couple of days, Reagan should never have been outside the office. And so Nancy really takes that to heart, puts her on retainer, starts chatting with her very, very frequently. And that's kind of how that emerges. But it all sort of blossoms from that Don Regan biography.
Yeah. $3,000 a month retainer. It's about $10,000 in today's money, so not nothing, and also
not at all nothing.
There's a little
not nothing
a month. I mean, my God, that's a full-time job.
I'd take it, yeah. And there's there's
and she was giving them a discounted rate.
Yeah.
So,
and there is a little bit of a slush fund wrinkle here too, because that money was not being routed in the most transparent of ways, and so there were a lot of things for the press to start to pick apart here. But this element around the assassination, I think, starts to help us understand a sort of bigger thing here too, because I think, and this is a big part of what you do so wonderfully in the series, but you get a picture in here of especially Nancy Reagan just wanting some sense of control around what feels like what must have been a very, very head-spinning time. And so do you read it that way? I mean, how do you see the kind of turn to this, not just from the Reagans, but as you mentioned, many other powerful people who are being pulled in many, many directions? What do you see as going on there in a bigger way?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the time, right, Anwar Sadat was assassinated in these years. Lots of world leaders were under attack. You think about Indira Gandhi would be assassinated not long after, the Pope John Paul, I think the first, is it? Who was the second? The second, right, was shot at the time. And so, all these, heads of state are under attack, and Nancy, if it means delaying her husband's schedule by an hour or 2 hours, and feeling like she can protect her husband, why wouldn't you do that, right? And the truth is, no one in office really minded this. Everyone from the secret security around her to the advisors, they were kind of okay with it. They didn't want it leaked, obviously, and it became a huge, huge hassle when it was, but no one found that to be a problem.
I think I'm sympathetic, only in the sense that she's not asking for something ridiculous or over the top. Do you know what I mean? Like, if it's a matter of shifting schedules or of thinking through something you might not have thought of before. I mean, I don't want to say it's completely harmless because it's not cheap, but like at the same time, I don't know, when I think about like, well, who's being harmed by this? It's really only her own pockets, I mean, to some extent. But yeah, I don't know. I think the stakes are so low. Maybe it seems a little trivial for me to like sort of throw Nancy under the bus for this, because I don't think she's operating in any other way that would be different from what most Americans would try to do.
And I mean, I'm not a Nancy Reagan fan, but it did make me empathetic. Like when you hear the way she talks about her husband almost losing his life, and the way he gets, I think twice during that night he almost passes away after he's shot, and the bullet is lodged so deeply into his lung and near his heart, and I mean, it's just human, right?
Yeah,
the idea that, like, of course you want to help and save your husband, and at the same time, there are these vast periods where Reagan kind of disappears. Like when the Iran-Contra stuff emerges, he doesn't do a press conference for a very long time, and there are all these questions of like, oh, did an astrologer tell him it would be better for his image if he doesn't do that for a very long time? You know, like, or wait till this date to respond, right? Because what emerges in that whole hullabaloo around the John Regan book is that this actually wasn't the first astrology scandal that had touched the Reagans.
I'm curious, too, about the role of the religious right in all of this, because I would imagine, especially for some particularly strict fundamentalist, the idea that the president and first lady were dabbling in astrology would have been pretty offensive, if not terrifying, especially in the middle of like the satanic panic of the 1980s. Here you have the president and the first lady consulting astrologists. What was the reaction from those corners of the political world?
They were livid. I mean, they had pulled their support together to like really, he'd stitched those constituencies to vote for him, and so all of a sudden they see their man leaning on something that they think is diabolical, and they have strong opinions about it. So it's funny because, you know, when Kellie first mentioned the Christmas and the star that these wise men follow, I mean, stars appear in the Bible so often, right? Even and like the phrase Mazel Tov is like, you know, your good stars or whatever, right? I mean, there are all these like ways that it shows up. And I was talking to A.J. Jacobs, the writer who did this book called The Year of Living Biblically, and it was stunning to me. He was like, oh, there's so many people who really, really disdain astrology. And in fact, one of the things I had to do as part of my book was he followed every like line in the Bible literally, essentially, or every rule, and so he said he had to stone an astrologer as part of his experiment. And so there's a whole scene where he drops a pebble on an astrologer, and she gets furious with him. But it tipped me off that you know it's really seen as a threat. And what's funny is Reagan gets a number of letters from evangelicals that are all housed in the Reagan archives, but one of them talks about kind of how dare you, because Jesus, one of the preachers, George Owens, I think at the time, spoke and said, Jesus spoke through me, God spoke through me, and told you that you would be the president, and now you're disobeying that through like this astrology and doing what exactly what's wrong.
So I mean, the irony is that you have like right-wing evangelicals who are like, God told me to tell you this, which doesn't feel very different at all from the astrologer who's like, oh, you should avoid this. I was thinking of I grew up in Sunday school hardcore. So like the story of I think it's like King Saul who goes to visit a witch.
Exactly.
And then he asks about like when's he gonna die or something like that, and the witch is like, you're gonna die tomorrow, and then he dies. And then there's this whole like thing about seeing mediums, you're gonna like, predict your own death or whatever. But I think there's a level of looking at astrology and witchcraft or like mediums as this satanic thing, but yet you also have other people in your ear saying this sort of prophetic, I heard from the Lord and this is what's going to happen kind of thing.
Yeah, and obviously, there's this trope of these megachurch leaders being corrupt, and similarly of astrologers, right? Like in India, it's a very common thing for an astrologer to tell you to buy a jewel to boost your astrological signal. If your Mercury's weak, you might have to buy an emerald or whatever, and they take a cut from the gem shop, and so like there's so much suspicion around these areas, and for good reason, but also it offers people great comfort and hope.
I'm so glad we've been talking about the kind of evangelical elements to presidencies, especially since this era. But there are other things that I was thinking about while listening to this and just thinking about this in general. But do you remember when there was that Obama thing about how he eats like 8 almonds as like part of his routine, and then there's like that thing about how like he only has one color suit because he doesn't want to make decisions and he wants to just choose, and most people heard that and were like, oh yeah, this is a hyper efficient, super rational, and I remember hearing that and being like, this is kind of very strange, and this is like borderline OCD behavior, and like there's a way to look at all of the things that we've been discussing here as in that same vein of like when you have such a high pressure life and have so many decisions that feel like there's no good answers, like there's lots of directions you could potentially turn for at least a semblance of control, not to say that like that's the best way to make decisions, but I mean in a large way that's how I read this stuff.
Yeah, and personally, it's really confusing in a way because part of the reason I did the show is because astrology, I said, I don't believe in astrology, but astrology keeps happening to me. And one of the reasons is because, like, my parents wouldn't be married if their charts didn't match up, right? Like, my mom's chart says that she can't have a mother-in-law, basically. Like, whatever her stars are would make a mother-in-law very ill and possibly pass away. And my dad's chart, or my dad just lost his mother at 1 year old. And so, like, in addition to all these other things that made them match, like they were allowed to go on a first date because of that, right? And you see astrology and religion in India all the time where like before there's a puja or a ceremony, right? Like they make these mounds to basically honor the stars and the planets. And so like it's so deeply connected to religion. And when I hear that statement, it feels like, oh, this religion, everything in this religious context makes sense. Mm-hmm. This completely doesn't make sense, right? Mm-hmm. And in the context of America, that's always like something that's and being American is always hard to stomach.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
As we wrap up, I'm curious kind of if you feel like this Reagan astrology story is still out there. I mean, Obama got into like very minor hot water because he had some quip about Nancy Reagan seances. What was the context? He was like asked whether he had talked to previous presidents after his election, and he said, all of the living ones, I didn't do a Nancy Reagan seance to talk to the dead ones, which is just a bad joke, first off. But also,
it's an offhanded joke.
But I don't know. Is that the most recent time this has bubbled up, or do you still see this out there?
I think it might be. I mean, it's funny because Nancy's press people got angry and responded to him and said, actually, it was Hillary Clinton who had done the seance and that wasn't even true. And so Obama had to write 2 apologies.
Gosh.
but you know that thing, Kellie, you said about Saul and being told when to die. This is just an aside, and you should totally cut this if you want. But I met this astrologer in India, and he was telling me that he basically learned this. You see how seriously these people take it, right? And they have like all these intense logarithms and like the charting and math and like understanding, and people get PhDs in astrology. And this guy learned astrology at the knee of his father, right? From the time he was 4 until he was like 21 or something. And his final act as an apprentice was his dad told him, "You have to tell me when I'll die." And just the heartbreak and the emotion of like believing in this thing and trying to figure it out, and then telling your father when he's going to pass. And then he said he was in England and he traveled back just because he had made this prediction, and his father passed in that, like, you know, that very brief window. And I mean, like, on one hand, I really don't believe in this, and on the other hand, there's like an eeriness that, like, as humans, it becomes a very obvious crutch.
And a very self-fulfilling prophecy, I guess. You know, when you put something out there, your expectation, you navigate around that expectation. So.
Although I have a to-do list and I rarely hit more than one or two things on it. So.
If only.
You just keep putting that one down at the bottom.
Can't get a to-do list done for anything.
Well, look, I mean, I'll just say that's kind of one of the wonderful things about this series. I think anyone who knows your work knows that you always have curiosity, but I think there's like an openness in this series that is really wonderful. And I get the feeling that you didn't really expect to go to the places that you end up going in this series, and so I really appreciate you doing that.
Oh, it's so fun to be here, and I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah. So Mangesh's series is called Skyline Drive. You can find it wherever you get your podcast. Shout out again to your producer, Mary. And this is the 4th episode, right? The Reagan episode?
The Reagan episode is the 3rd episode. And then the 4th one looks into the astrology of BTS.
Yeah. And there's going to be eight total as well.
Yeah.
Right. Great. All right. So go check it out, Skyline Drive. And let's have you back on the show to talk about other stuff.
That'd be wonderful. I'd love that.
Yeah. Okay. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.